WWII 4, 1942. 10:19 in the morning. The Pacific is unnaturally calm. 4 Japanese fleet carriers cut through the blue water northwest of Midway Atoll. On the decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, aircraft stand armed and fueled. Torpedoes glisten in the sun. Bomb carts roll across steel planking still warm from the early strike against the island. Mechanics move with disciplined precision. Signal flags rise and fall in measured rhythm. Below decks, maps lie open. Reports are being compiled. The Imperial Navy believes it is moments away from finishing the trap. Then, from high above the scattered cloud cover, comes a distant mechanical wail. Thin at first, almost uncertain. Heads tilt upward. Out of the sun, shapes appear. Small. Angular. Diving. American SBD Dauntless bombers. In less than 5 minutes, the balance of power in the Pacific will begin to burn, and the sound of their descent will echo far beyond Midway's coral shores. The world's most experienced carrier force is about to discover that supremacy at sea can vanish in a single morning. December 7, 1941. The stillness above Pearl Harbor shattered beneath descending aircraft marked with the red sun. In less than 2 hours, the Pacific Fleet of the United States had been crippled. Battleships burned. Airfields were torn open. More than 2,400 Americans were dead. Across the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy stood at the height of its operational brilliance. The strike had been planned under the strategic vision of Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet. Yamamoto understood American industrial capacity. He knew Japan could not win a prolonged war of production. His solution was swift, decisive shock, a crushing blow that would fracture American morale and force negotiation before factories could outproduce fleets. In the months that followed Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces moved with astonishing speed. Hong Kong fell. Malaya collapsed. Singapore surrendered in February 1942, delivering more than 80,000 Allied troops into captivity. The Philippines were overwhelmed. Bataan and Corregidor succumbed by May. The Dutch East Indies were seized for oil. Guam and Wake Island were taken. Across a vast arc from Burma to the Solomons, the rising sun advanced. At sea, Japanese naval aviation appeared untouchable. The 6 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor represented the most experienced concentration of naval air power in the world. Their pilots were veterans of China and the opening Pacific offensives. Their Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters outclassed many Allied aircraft in range and maneuverability. Their doctrine, honed through years of rigorous training, emphasized coordination, speed, and overwhelming first strikes. The United States, by contrast, was reeling. Battleships lay at the bottom of Pearl Harbor's harbor mud. Aircraft losses were heavy. The Pacific seemed exposed. Yet beneath the smoke, 3 American fleet carriers had been absent from Pearl Harbor on December 7. USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga. They would become the nucleus of resistance. Early 1942 became a race, not of territory, but of carriers. In April, American bombers led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle launched from the carrier USS Hornet and struck Tokyo itself. Militarily modest, the raid shocked Japanese leadership. It exposed vulnerability. It challenged assumptions. It confirmed Yamamoto's fears. The United States would not negotiate. It would fight. The Imperial Japanese Navy responded with a bold plan intended to end the carrier threat permanently. Yamamoto envisioned drawing out the remaining American carriers into a decisive engagement. The Kantai-Kessen, the long-anticipated climactic fleet battle. The target chosen was Midway Atoll, a small but strategically vital outpost roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. If Midway fell, Japanese aircraft could threaten Pearl Harbor directly and extend the defensive perimeter of the empire deeper into the Pacific. The plan was intricate and sprawling. Multiple task forces would operate across thousands of miles. A diversion toward the Aleutian Islands would draw American attention northward. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo would command the First Air Fleet, the striking force centered on the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. They would bombard Midway, lure out American carriers, and destroy them. On paper, The plan promised annihilation of the remaining U.S. naval air power. Japanese commanders expected surprise once again. They believed American morale remained shaken from Pearl Harbor and the fall of the Philippines. Intelligence estimates suggested only 1 or 2 American carriers might be operational. The Imperial Navy's aviators were confident. They had not yet been decisively defeated in carrier combat. But beneath the surface of this confidence lay a structural vulnerability. Japanese naval aviation relied on a relatively small cadre of elite pilots. Training replacement aviators to comparable standards required years. Losses could not easily be replaced. Aircraft production, though capable, could not match American industrial scale. Meanwhile, in Hawaii, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz studied intercepted signals in a dim operations room. American cryptanalysts were quietly dismantling the assumption of Japanese surprise. The coming battle would not be a trap sprung upon an unsuspecting fleet. It would be a collision shaped by intelligence, calculation, and risk, and by a decision that would place American carriers exactly where Japanese doctrine believed they would not be. The key to the American advantage lay not in visible strength, but in information. At a secret naval intelligence unit known as Station HYPO in Hawaii, codebreakers worked through fragmented Japanese communications. The chief figure guiding this effort was Commander Cryptanalyst Joseph Rochefort. Japanese messages were intercepted and slowly reconstructed. The code designation AF had been appearing repeatedly in decrypted traffic. American analysts suspected that AF referred to Midway. To confirm the suspicion, a deceptive message was sent from Midway's garrison. The base transmitted a routine signal reporting that its freshwater distillation system had failed. Shortly afterward, Japanese intelligence traffic reported that AF is short of water. The confirmation was quiet but decisive. Admiral Nimitz now faced a strategic gamble. Japanese naval doctrine assumed surprise and numerical superiority would secure victory. Yet American carrier strength was limited. Only 3 fleet carriers were immediately available. USS Enterprise under the operational grouping of Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, USS Hornet, and the damaged but hastily repaired USS Yorktown commanded operationally by Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. Yorktown was especially fragile. After the Battle of the Coral Sea, the carrier had been patched together in only 3 days of emergency repair work at Pearl Harbor. Technicians worked around the clock, welding steel, patching systems, and preparing the ship for combat again. What should have been a month-long overhaul was compressed into a few desperate days. Nimitz's decision was controversial. Instead of dispersing his carriers defensively, he placed them northeast of Midway, hoping to intercept Japanese forces before they could strike the atoll itself. The American carriers were instructed to remain concealed until Japanese aircraft were committed to the attack. The tactical logic was simple but dangerous. If Japanese scouts detected the American fleet first, the Japanese First Air Fleet could launch a coordinated strike with superior positioning. American forces also relied heavily on aircraft launched from Midway's airfield. Marine Corps and Navy pilots stationed on the island were ordered to attack the approaching invasion force even if their survival probability was low. The defense of Midway would therefore be conducted in layers. First, land-based aircraft from the atoll itself would harass the Japanese fleet. Second, torpedo bombers and dive bombers from American carriers would attempt to break Japanese air defenses. Finally, once Japanese carrier decks were cluttered with refueling and rearming aircraft, the moment Nagumo's doctrine inadvertently created, American dive bombers would strike. In the Japanese fleet, meanwhile, confidence remained high. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the carrier strike force. Nagumo was a surface Navy officer rather than a specialist in naval aviation doctrine. His operational philosophy emphasized caution once initial objectives were achieved. On the morning of June 4, Midway's airfields were bombarded by Japanese carrier aircraft. Runways were cratered. Hangars burned. Yet the American defenders continued launching obsolete torpedo squadrons and aging fighters into the sky. The attack waves were scattered and often destroyed before reaching Japanese ships. Losses among American torpedo squadrons were devastating. Some formations lost nearly their entire flight groups. But their sacrifice served a strategic function. drawing Japanese combat air patrols downward and exhausting defensive interception patterns. Inside Nagumo's flagship, the carrier Akagi, reports arrived that American ships might be present nearby. At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo faced a critical decision. The Japanese strike aircraft had returned from Midway and were sitting on carrier decks armed with land attack bombs. Naval doctrine required flexibility, but the fleet was in the middle of rearming operations. Nagumo ordered a reversal. The aircraft were to be reconfigured for anti-ship combat. Fuel lines were opened. Bombs were removed and replaced with torpedoes. Mechanics worked rapidly across steel flight decks already crowded with machines of war. This decision created one of the most dangerous vulnerabilities in carrier warfare: a concentration of explosive ordnance, fuel vapors, and exposed aircraft inside hangars. Above the Japanese fleet, search aircraft were still trying to locate American carriers. They failed to detect the approaching American strike groups. The sky over the Pacific remained deceptively empty. And then, at approximately 10:20 a.m., the silence broke under the scream of dive bomber engines descending from high altitude. The sound would become the turning point of the battle. The Battle of Midway was not only a confrontation of fleets. It was a collision of expectations, discipline, fear, and technological philosophy. Beneath the burning steel and explosive detonations lay human psychology shaped by two very different visions of war. The first angle was the human dimension of Japanese naval aviation culture. Japanese carrier pilots represented one of the most elite military aviation groups ever assembled during the early 20th century. Selection was brutal. Training could last several years and demanded extreme endurance, precision, and loyalty to the imperial mission. Many pilots entered service believing that sacrifice in battle was the highest expression of honor. This ideological framework was rooted in the broader wartime philosophy of the Imperial Japanese military structure. The concept of victory was often tied to decisive offensive action followed by strategic psychological dominance. Pilots flying from Akagi and her sister carriers had fought across the Pacific since the early expansion campaigns. Their combat experience in China and earlier naval operations gave them confidence that American air forces were technologically inferior and operationally disorganized. Yet that confidence carried structural weakness. Japanese naval aviation operated with limited replacement pipelines. Each experienced pilot lost represented a disproportionate strategic cost. Some historical estimates suggest that by 1942, the Japanese Navy had already begun experiencing strain in maintaining pilot quality as expansion accelerated. American strategy, by contrast, leaned toward mass industrial production rather than elite specialization. The United States was transforming civilian manufacturing capacity into military output. Aircraft factories in California, Texas, and the Midwest were producing fighters, bombers, and spare parts at accelerating speed. The doctrine behind American warfare was not to create the perfect pilot, but to create enough pilots. When American SBD Dauntless dive bombers descended toward the Japanese fleet, the attack embodied that philosophy. The pilots of the USS Enterprise Air Group approached from altitude, flying through thin layers of cloud. They were trained to strike from unexpected vectors rather than engage in prolonged dogfights. The SBD Dauntless aircraft itself symbolized American engineering philosophy during the war. The dive bomber carried a powerful 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb beneath its fuselage. The aircraft was not the fastest machine in the sky, but it was extraordinarily stable during steep dives. Pilots activated their dive brakes. The mechanical whine of airflow resistance became the acoustic signature of American carrier power. The Japanese fleet, at that moment, was in one of the most dangerous tactical states possible in naval warfare. Nagumo's ships were caught between operational phases. Decks of Kaga were filled with fueled aircraft waiting for rearming orders. Elevators were transporting ordnance between hangar decks and flight surfaces. Fuel lines ran exposed in several maintenance zones. Japanese combat air patrol fighters were flying lower, chasing American torpedo squadrons that had attempted attacks earlier. This created an aerial gap above the fleet. American dive bombers entered that gap. The tactical lesson was simple but devastating. Carrier fleets were most vulnerable when they were preparing to strike, not when they were striking. Japanese doctrine had emphasized offensive momentum. American planners exploited operational transition moments. Inside the Japanese command structure, communications were becoming increasingly chaotic. Reports began reaching Nagumo's bridge that unidentified aircraft were diving from high altitude. But radar detection and rapid interception response were limited. The Japanese fleet had powerful aircraft, but its defensive coordination system was not designed to respond to multi-vector simultaneous dive attacks. At approximately 10:22 a.m., the first American bombs would fall toward the decks of the Imperial Japanese carriers. The Pacific sky was about to turn into burning steel and black smoke. The technological contrast between the two naval powers was not measured only by aircraft numbers, but by the entire ecosystem surrounding combat aviation. American naval aviation doctrine emphasized flexible strike coordination and industrial sustainability. Aircraft such as the SBD Dauntless were built to survive extreme dive angles, violent air pressure shifts, and the shock of releasing heavy ordnance from near-vertical trajectories. The aircraft's perforated dive brakes allowed pilots to maintain controlled descent speeds around 250 miles per hour during attack runs. This mechanical reliability mattered because American training programs could rapidly produce replacement pilots. Flight schools expanded across the continental United States, turning civilian airfields into military training centers. Japanese aviation training, by contrast, focused on exceptional individual skill development. Cadets underwent rigorous selection, and operational flight experience was considered sacred knowledge that could not be easily replaced once lost. The philosophical divergence reflected deeper industrial realities. The United States possessed what historians later described as overwhelming production depth. During 1942 alone, American factories produced thousands of combat aircraft. Japanese wartime industry, constrained by raw material imports and strategic bombing vulnerability, struggled to maintain comparable output. Leadership style also influenced the battle's outcome. Chester W. Nimitz operated with a calm strategic patience that contrasted with the more aggressive offensive posture expected in Pacific naval warfare. Nimitz delegated tactical execution to officers such as Raymond A. Spruance, allowing operational flexibility. Spruance himself was not a traditional aggressive fleet commander. Some senior officers considered him cautious. However, that caution proved decisive. When Japanese carriers were located, Spruance ordered immediate launch of available strike aircraft rather than waiting to assemble larger, more coordinated formations. This decision increased attack speed at the cost of formation cohesion. The human cost of this war philosophy was visible in the fate of American torpedo squadrons. Torpedo Squadron 8 from USS Hornet launched an attack run that became one of the most tragic episodes of the battle. Flying the obsolete TBD Devastator torpedo bomber, the squadron approached Japanese carriers at low altitude. Japanese Zero fighters intercepted them almost immediately. The Devastator aircraft were slow and poorly armored compared to the Japanese A6M0 fighters. Many American pilots were shot down before reaching effective torpedo release range. Historical casualty records show that only one pilot from that squadron survived the battle. Yet their sacrifice accomplished an unintended tactical function. Japanese combat air patrols descended to low altitude to engage the torpedo bombers. Fuel consumption increased. Pilot fatigue grew. The defensive sky coverage above the carriers weakened. That weakness would soon be exploited by the American dive bombers approaching from the sun's direction. On the Japanese flagship Akagi, alarms began echoing across compartments as lookout crews finally identified incoming aircraft silhouettes. But the warning came too late. The dive bombers had already begun their attack descent. The Pacific War would change within the next 5 minutes. 10:20 a.m. The American dive bombers broke formation and entered their terminal attack dives. From the perspective of Japanese sailors on the flight decks, the sky suddenly filled with dark silhouettes growing rapidly larger against the sunlight. The first target was Kaga. 4 SBD Dauntless aircraft descended almost vertically, engines screaming under aerodynamic stress. The pilots held their dive angles steady, eyes fixed on the geometric center of the flight deck. At 10:22 a.m., a 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb struck Kaga near the forward elevator assembly. Steel plating ruptured inward. Fuel vapors ignited. Secondary explosions followed as parked aircraft loaded with ordnance detonated across the deck. Within minutes, Kaga became a burning mass of shattered aviation fuel, torn aluminum, and collapsing structural frames. Japanese damage control crews attempted emergency firefighting operations, but aviation gasoline fires behaved differently from conventional fires. Water alone could not extinguish burning fuel spreading across hangar decks. Almost simultaneously, another group of American dive bombers attacked Akagi. Akagi was Nagumo's flagship. One bomb penetrated through the flight deck and exploded inside the upper hangar level. The shockwave shattered aircraft stored for rearming operations. Flames surged upward through maintenance corridors. Naval historians later recorded that Akagi's steering control systems began failing shortly after the internal explosion. Radio communications aboard the flagship became chaotic. Damage reports multiplied. Nagumo reportedly stood silently as the realization spread that the fleet had been caught during its most vulnerable operational phase. At 10:24 a.m., the third carrier fell under attack. Soryu was struck by multiple bombs during a single dive bombing pass. 3 direct hits penetrated flight deck armor and triggered catastrophic hangar fires. Within roughly 15 minutes, the operational combat capability of Soryu was effectively destroyed. Sailors attempted to abandon compartments as explosions propagated through fuel storage zones. Some crew members jumped into the Pacific waters surrounding the burning ship. The sea itself began reflecting columns of black smoke rising vertically into the morning sky. Japanese combat fighters attempted counterattacks, but the American dive bombers had already completed their release trajectories. The sound of SBD engines fading into distance was replaced by detonations and emergency signal horns across the fleet. Then, at approximately 10:26 a.m., the fourth carrier entered the American strike zone. The final blow of the morning fell upon Hiryu. Unlike the other Japanese carriers, Hiryu managed to avoid immediate destruction because it was positioned slightly apart from the main formation. This separation allowed Japanese forces a brief operational window to organize a counterstrike. From Hiryu's flight deck, surviving Japanese aircraft were launched in a desperate attempt to locate and attack American carriers. The counterattack eventually reached USS Yorktown. Japanese dive bombers struck Yorktown with precision. Multiple bombs penetrated flight deck structures, causing fires and system failures. The carrier lost propulsion temporarily and began listing. Damage control teams worked with extreme urgency. Despite severe damage, Yorktown did not immediately sink. Engineers attempted to stabilize power systems while evacuation preparations were ordered. Meanwhile, American reconnaissance aircraft located Hiryu. At approximately 5 p.m., American carrier aircraft launched a retaliatory strike against the remaining Japanese carrier. Dive bombers from USS Enterprise attacked Hiryu with coordinated precision. Multiple bomb hits ignited uncontrollable fires across hangar compartments. Fuel lines ruptured. Aircraft waiting for launch burned before leaving the deck. By evening, the situation for the Imperial Japanese Navy was irreversible. Hiryu was abandoned by its crew during the night of June 4 to 5, 1942. The ship was later scuttled or destroyed following continued damage progression. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo ordered remaining Japanese forces to withdraw from Midway operations. Signals transmitted across the fleet carried the implicit acknowledgement that the operation had failed. The Kantai-Kessen doctrine, the dream of a single decisive fleet battle, had collapsed not through prolonged engagement, but through a brief window of vulnerability exploited by intelligence and timing. Japanese naval aviation had lost 4 fleet carriers, approximately 248 aircraft in carrier air groups alone, and a significant number of experienced pilots whose replacement would take years. American losses were also real. The carrier USS Yorktown would later sink after continued damage, and nearly 300 American servicemen died during the battle. Yet strategically, the outcome was absolute. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never again possess the offensive carrier strength it had wielded before Midway. The morning smoke over Midway had not yet cleared when the strategic reality of the battle began spreading across both naval command centers. By the end of the engagement, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These ships were not simply vessels. They represented the core striking doctrine of Japan's early Pacific expansion. Naval records estimate that Japanese carrier aviation losses included roughly 150 experienced pilots, though exact numbers vary among historical sources. What was universally acknowledged was that many of these aviators were among the most trained personnel in the Japanese military aviation structure. Replacement was nearly impossible in the short term. The United States, despite losing the carrier USS Yorktown, achieved a strategic victory that reshaped the Pacific War. American aircraft losses during the battle totaled approximately 150 aircraft across carrier and Midway-based squadrons. However, the U.S. industrial system was already prepared to replenish such losses. Factories operating under wartime mobilization were accelerating production of new naval aircraft designs. Training pipelines for pilots were expanding across the continental United States. The psychological impact of the battle was equally profound. Japanese military leadership had expected Midway to serve as a repetition of earlier expansion victories. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto reportedly expressed deep concern after receiving operational reports. Historical accounts suggest that Yamamoto recognized the loss of carrier aviation strength would force Japan into a defensive posture. The Japanese naval command structure struggled to reconcile the defeat with its prior strategic assumptions. The doctrine of decisive battle had failed in a way that traditional naval thinking had not predicted. The failure was not caused by numerical inferiority alone. It was produced by a combination of intelligence advantage, operational timing, and aircraft deployment vulnerability. The cryptographic work led by Joseph Rochefort became one of the most significant intelligence successes in naval warfare history. American command later acknowledged that without code-breaking operations, the positioning of carrier forces near Midway would have been far more uncertain. The battle also revealed the emergence of carrier-based air power as the dominant instrument of naval warfare. Battleships, which had historically been considered the primary symbol of maritime strength, were now increasingly vulnerable to coordinated aerial strikes launched from beyond visual horizon range. The destruction of Japanese carriers forced the Imperial Navy to shift strategy toward defensive perimeter protection rather than offensive expansion. Within months, American forces would begin planning the Guadalcanal campaign, initiating a long process of rolling back Japanese territorial gains across the Pacific. On the home front in the United States, news of the victory was initially treated cautiously because of wartime censorship policies. Public awareness of the full scale of the victory grew gradually, but within military circles, Midway was immediately recognized as a turning point. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz later summarized the operational significance of the battle by stating that Midway was the most important naval victory in history. The consequences of the battle unfolded slowly across the Pacific horizon like a change in wind that no fleet could reverse. The destruction of Japanese carrier aviation at Midway did not immediately end the war, but it permanently altered the strategic balance. Japanese industrial infrastructure was heavily constrained by access to raw materials. The empire depended on maritime supply routes stretching across occupied Southeast Asia. As American submarine warfare intensified, these routes became increasingly vulnerable. Over the next 2 years, American naval construction would introduce new carrier groups into the Pacific theater at a scale Japan could not match. By 1944, the United States operated dozens of fleet and light carriers supported by mass-produced aircraft models. The Japanese Navy attempted to rebuild its carrier air groups, but pilot training programs could not replace the experience lost at Midway. Some replacement pilots were deployed with significantly fewer flight hours compared to the veterans lost in 1942. The strategic initiative of the Pacific War gradually shifted toward American offensive operations. The island-hopping campaign would emerge as the primary method of advance, targeting strategically important bases while bypassing heavily fortified Japanese positions. The legacy of the battle also reshaped naval doctrine worldwide. Military planners observed that control of the air above naval formations had become decisive. Surface fleets operating without air cover were increasingly vulnerable to long-range strike aircraft. The sinking of 4 fleet carriers demonstrated that maritime supremacy was no longer defined by battleship armor or gun caliber alone. After Midway, The Japanese Imperial Navy would never regain the same level of offensive carrier capability. Admiral Yamamoto continued planning defensive naval actions but faced growing material shortages and production limitations. In 1943, his own life would be lost during an American interception operation over the Solomon Islands, symbolizing the relentless reach of aerial warfare that had begun at Midway. The Pacific War would continue for 3 more years, consuming millions of lives across islands, oceans, and cities. Yet the outcome of that vast struggle was quietly influenced by a single morning when 4 burning carriers filled the horizon with black smoke. The Battle of Midway left more than wreckage scattered across a distant coral sea. It left a philosophical fracture in the way humanity understood power at sea. The metallic scream of the American dive bomber, that mechanical, descending wail of the SBD Dauntless, became an accidental symbol of a new age. It represented the transformation of industrial democracy into strategic force. Factories, training schools, and coordinated intelligence networks could now challenge traditions built upon elite warrior culture. Before Midway, naval warfare had been measured by visible strength, armor thickness, gun size, and fleet tonnage. After Midway, power moved silently above the horizon. The ocean no longer belonged to the ship closest to the enemy. It belonged to the force that could find the enemy first and strike before detection. The Imperial Japanese Navy entered the battle believing that disciplined courage and operational audacity could produce decisive victory. The United States entered the battle believing that information, production depth, and technological coordination could sustain prolonged resistance. Neither philosophy was entirely new, but Midway revealed which system could adapt faster under the pressure of modern mechanized war. In the years following the battle, historians would debate many technical factors: code-breaking operations, pilot fatigue, command hesitation, and aircraft deployment timing. Yet beneath those technical arguments lies a simpler truth. War is not only fought by machines or by strategy alone. It is fought by the capacity of a society to absorb loss, replace it, and continue moving forward. Midway became a turning point not because it ended the Pacific War, but because it revealed that the era of invincible fleet dominance was fading. The ocean, once a theater ruled by massive armored ships, had become a battlefield where intelligence traveled faster than gunfire and where a single moment of vulnerability could decide the fate of empires. Freedom and survival in the 20th century were no longer guaranteed by the size of a navy alone. They were determined by the quiet, relentless rhythm of industry, science, and human endurance. And somewhere in the silent Pacific, beneath the waves where 4 Japanese carriers once burned under the morning sun, history preserved the memory of a war that changed the meaning of naval power forever.